Welcome, my dears. What a wonderful surprise to see you all here. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Mother Goose, and I'm so glad that I can share with you all today my 3 favourite fairy tales. They're full of magic, wonder, evil ogres, witches, princes and princesses. So, my dears, are you all sitting comfortably? Well, let's begin. My first story is about a very, very clever cat, a young man named Jack, an evil ogre, and a beautiful princess. It's called Puss in Boots. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there lived a miller who had 3 sons. When the miller died, he left his eldest son the mill, and the eldest son, he was very happy. And he left his second son his donkey, and the second son, he was very happy. And to his third son, Jack, who was the youngest, he left him his cat. Now Jack wasn't very happy. "What am I going to do with a cat?" he moaned. "I shall surely starve to death." Suddenly, he heard a voice. "A cat is the very best present indeed," it said. "Who said that?" said Jack. "'Tis me, Puss. And not only am I a talking cat, I'm also a very, very clever cat. If you do what I say, I shall make you your fortune and all will be well. Fetch me a fine hat and a fine coat and a pair of leather boots and a bag, and I shall do the rest and all will be well." Well, Jack agreed, my dears. He had nothing left to lose. So the next day, Jack brought all the things that Puss had requested, and the cat dressed himself in the fine hat and the fine coat and pulled on the leather boots, and he looked very gallant indeed. He took some lettuces from the garden and put them in a bag, and he went to a field that was surrounded by rabbit warrens. He laid himself down on the ground and pretended to be asleep. It wasn't long before a foolish rabbit had crept into the bag. As soon as it did, Puss jumped up, swung the bag over his shoulder, and marched to the castle and demanded to see the king. "I have come, your highness, from my master, the Prince of Carabas, and he has sent you this rabbit as a gift for your pleasure." Well, the king was very impressed indeed. "Carabas," said the king. "I've never heard of such a place." "Oh, it's a very small place," said Puss, "but it's very, very rich indeed. You must understand, children, that the Prince of Carabas was a title invented by Puss for his master Jack." The next day, Puss did the same thing. He caught some partridges, and he went to the castle and gave them to the king. And he did this for 3 months. He captured fish, birds, and animals and sent them to the king. And the king was so impressed, and he was very, very grateful to the generosity of this Prince of Carabas. One day, Puss was at the palace, and he overheard 2 servants saying that the king that very afternoon was going to take a ride in his carriage by the riverside. He was going to take with him his daughter, the princess, who was the most beautiful princess in the world. Puss knew that he didn't have a lot of time to lose, so he rushed to his master Jack and he said, Master, just do what I say and your fortune will be made. Go to the river this instant and bathe in the water." Well, Jack agreed. When his master Jack was in the river bathing, Puss, the clever cat, gathered all of his dirty, brown, humble old clothes and hid them under a huge rock. Then Puss waited by the road for the king's carriage to pass by, and when it did, he rushed out and shouted, your highness, come quick, you must help. My master, the Prince of Carabas, is drowning in the river, and not only this, some thieves have stolen all of his fine clothes." Well, the king recognised the cat immediately and was, "Oh, yes, of course, oh dear, how awful," he said. And he sent his guardsmen to retrieve the bewildered and very wet Prince of Carabas from the river. And he sent 2 of his servants to the palace to retrieve a fine outfit of gold and red velvet for the Prince of Carabas to wear. When the Prince of Carabas was in his fine clothes, the princess fell deeply in love with him. And the Prince of Carabas, well, he fell deeply in love with the princess. In fact, the princess was so in love with the prince that she asked the king if he could come for a ride in the carriage with them. The king could see that they were both in love, and he agreed. Meanwhile, Puss had run along the road, and he got to some fields where some workers were toiling. He walked over to them. Excuse me," he said, "but who do these fields belong to?" "They belong to an evil ogre. He works us all day with no pay," they said. Said Puss. "Well, if I promise to kill the ogre, when the king's carriage passes along here in a short while, will you tell him if he asks that this land belongs to the Prince of Carabas?" "All right," they said. Well, they really didn't have nothing to lose, my dears. "But good luck killing that ogre. He's really evil and he can change into any animal he likes." Puss carried on along the road, asking all the workers to do the same thing. And when the king's carriage rode through the land and he asked the workers who this wonderful land belonged to, they all said that it belonged to the Prince of Carabas. The king was very, very impressed. Meanwhile, Puss had got to the castle of the evil ogre. He opened the huge door. It went. Puss shivered in his boots. He stepped forward. Suddenly he heard a loud booming voice. "Who goes there?" it shouted. It is I, just a humble cat," said Puss. "I've just come to pay my respects to you, a very famous ogre who I believe can change into any animal he wants." "Of course I can, you silly cat," he said. And piff, paff, puff, the ogre turned himself into a huge lion. Roar! Puss was terrified and darted under a table. Puss waited until the ogre changed himself back and came out and said, "That was very, very impressive. But can you turn yourself into something very, very small, like, say, a mouse?" "Of course I can, you silly cat," said the ogre. And piff, paff, puff, the ogre had turned into a little mouse. Squeak, squeak, it went. This is exactly what Puss wanted, and he pounced upon the mouse and he ate it all up. Perfect. Suddenly, Puss heard the king's carriage along the drawbridge, and he ran downstairs to greet the king. "Welcome, your highness," he said. "Welcome to the castle that belongs to my noble master, the Prince of Carabas." Well, the king was very impressed by the castle. In fact, my dears, he was so impressed that he decided that the prince and the princess were to be married that very day. And Puss in Boots was made a noble lord, and he was the happiest guest at the wedding. And they all lived happily ever after. Hooray! What a very, very clever cat he was, wasn't he, my dears? If you could turn yourself into any animal your heart desires, I wonder what it would be. Now, my next story involves a very handsome prince, a wicked old witch, and a lot of very long golden hair. Which reminds me, I must get myself to the hairdresser's. Now, are you sitting comfortably? I shall tell you the story of Rapunzel. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there lived a husband and his wife. The husband and his wife were very, very happy, apart from one thing: they couldn't have any children. The house had a window that looked over the most beautiful garden. It was full of flowers and the most succulent and ripest vegetables you could imagine. Now, children, your mums and dads have reliably informed me that you eat your fresh green vegetables up every single day. Unfortunately, the garden was owned by a very, very wicked old witch. In fact, she was so powerful, she was feared all over the world. One day, the wife was looking out the window and her eyes gazed upon a very, very rich and juicy succulent lettuce called Rapunzel. She craved and craved for this leafy green vegetable so much that she became very, very sad and very, very ill. She said to her husband, "Husband, if you don't fetch me some of that leafy green salad, I'm sure I'm going to waste away and die." Well, naturally, the husband, my dears, was very, very concerned. He loved his wife very much and he wanted her to be happy. So he agreed that that night, under cover of darkness, he was going to climb the wall and fetch his wife some of the lettuce. And he did. The next day, the wife made a salad out of the vegetables, and it tasted so wonderful, much better than she expected, that her desire for the vegetables, well, it grew even stronger. So she asked her husband to get her some more. And with a heavy heart and a deep sigh, he agreed. So that night, under cover of darkness again, he climbed the wall. But as soon as he got to the other side, he came face to face with the wicked old witch.
Boo! "What are you doing in my garden?" she cried. "How dare you steal my vegetables? Prepare to be punished!"
"Oh, don't hurt me," cried the husband. "Please don't hurt me. I came here to pick some of the leafy green vegetables because my wife, she's so ill and unhappy, and I thought picking these vegetables would make her feel so much better." Said the witch.
"If this is what you say is true, then you can help yourself to as much vegetables as you like, on one condition. The child that your wife is about to bring into the world, you must give it to me."
Yes, yes, of course," agreed the husband in his terror. And so it was. 3 months later, the wife gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and the witch came and carried her away. The witch named the girl Rapunzel, and she grew up to be the most beautiful girl you've ever seen. When Rapunzel was 13, she locked her away in a tall tower in the middle of a wood, with no door or stair. So when the witch visited, she had to shout,
"Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair."
Rapunzel had the most beautiful long golden hair that she kept in long braided plaits. And when the witch came to visit, she unlocked her hair and it fell to the floor, and the witch climbed up. And so they lived like this for quite a few years. Then one day, a handsome prince on his white horse was riding through the forest, and he heard the most beautiful singing voice he had ever heard. La, 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 la. He was so bewitched by the voice that he had to find out who it belonged to. So he walked up to the tower and he walked round and round, but he couldn't see a door. So he went away, but he was so desperate to find out who that voice belonged to, he turned up the next day. When he was in the wood, he heard some footsteps creeping up behind him, and he hid behind a tree. And sure enough, there was the witch, and she shouted up,
"Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair."
And the prince watched in amazement as 2 long plaits of beautiful golden hair like spun gold fell cascading towards the floor. And he watched the witch climb up. Aha! said the prince to himself. So that's the staircase. When the witch had left, the prince went to the bottom of the tower and he called up for himself. What did he say, children? Let me hear you. That's right. He shouted, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair." And sure enough, the 2 long plaits of gold fell to the floor and he climbed up. When he jumped for the window, Rapunzel was terrified. She'd never seen a man before. But the prince was kind and gentle, and he put her at ease, and he told her all about the world outside. So he visited her again, and both of them fell deeply in love with each other. And the prince asked her to marry him, and she agreed. Well, after all, my dear, he was young and handsome. But Rapunzel said, "But how can I marry you? How can I get down from this tower and be free?" But then she had an idea. She said to the prince, "On every single visit that you take, bring a long piece of scarf and I shall tie them together and make a rope, and I will climb down and we can get married and you can take me away on your white horse." It was a very good idea, and of course, my dears, the witch knew nothing about this. Until one day, Rapunzel completely forgot herself, and as the witch was climbing up, she said, "How come you're so much more heavier than the prince? He seems so much lighter than you, and he's up here in a moment." Well, the witch was furious. "You treacherous child," she said, "a handsome prince indeed." And she grabbed Rapunzel's long golden hair and twisted it around her hand and took a pair of scissors and snip, snap, she cut off all of Rapunzel's beautiful golden hair. But she wasn't done then. She was so angry she banished Rapunzel to a far-off desert, so Rapunzel could live the rest of her life out miserable and all alone. Then the witch took the plaits and put them on a hook next to the window. Sure enough, that day, the prince came to pay his regular visit to his beloved, and he shouted at the bottom of the tower, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair." And as always, the 2 beautiful golden plaits descended, and he climbed up to the window. But on this occasion, instead of coming face to face with his beautiful Rapunzel, he came face to face with the wicked old witch. "Aha!" she said. "So you're the handsome prince. Ugh. You will never see your Rapunzel again," she said. "That bird has flown, and you will never hear her sweet singing voice again. She has been banished forever." The prince was terrified, and he fell backwards and landed in a bush of thorns that scratched out his eyes. He was blind, and he was so heartbroken he wandered the wood for years and years, eating roots and berries, lamenting the loss of his beautiful bride Rapunzel. Then one day, a few years later, he came to the desert where Rapunzel lived, and he heard the most beautiful sweet singing voice. And he knew straight away that that voice belonged to his beloved Rapunzel. So he went into the direction of the voice, and Rapunzel saw him approaching, and she recognized him straight away, and they just hugged and wept and wept and wept. They were so happy to be in each other's arms again. The tears that Rapunzel wept fell into the prince's eyes, and he could see again. So he led her to his kingdom, and they were welcomed back with much joy. And as for the witch, what do you think happened to her, my dears? Well, when the handsome prince fell from the window, he took both of Rapunzel's plaits with him. So the wicked witch was lost in her own tower for ever and ever. And as for the prince and Rapunzel, well, they lived happily ever after.
Hooray!
Well, 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 my dears, what a horrible, wicked witch she was, and I'm so glad that she got her comeuppance. And Rapunzel and the prince lived happily ever after. My next story involves 2 sisters, a dwarf, a big brown bear, and a handsome prince. The story is called Rose White and Rose Red. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, there was a poor widow who lived in a cottage in the middle of a forest. In the garden of that cottage were 2 rose bushes, and every year one bloomed white roses and the other bush bloomed red roses. Now the widow loved these 2 rose bushes so much that when she had 2 daughters, she named one daughter Rose White and the other daughter Rose Red. Now Rose White was a shy and quiet girl who liked to read and help her mother out round the cottage. And Rose Red, well, she was a lively girl who liked to sing and chase butterflies through the meadows. Both of the sisters loved each other dearly, and they were also much beloved by all the creatures of the forest. During the winter months, the family would gather round the fire and read to each other and do some spinning. One night, as they were reading to each other, they heard a loud knock at the door. The widow asked Rose Red to open it, thinking it was a lost traveller who needed some directions. When Rose Red opened the door, expecting to see a lost traveller, there stood instead a big brown bear. "Ah!" screamed Rose Red, and ran to hide behind her mother and her sister. But the bear called after her. "Don't be afraid," said the bear. "I won't hurt you. I'm just so cold and I'm freezing from being in the snow for hours and hours. Can I just warm myself by your fire?" Well, the widow took pity on the poor bear and she called him in at once. She called to her 2 daughters. "Come out of your hiding places, Rose White and Rose Red. This bear won't hurt you. He's a kind and friendly bear." And indeed, when the 2 sisters saw the bear rolling around the rug growling in contentment, they tickled him. They got on so famously that when it came to bedtime, the poor widow didn't have the heart to throw the bear out back in the snow. And in the morning, the 2 sisters let the bear out so he could find food for himself in the forest. And all through the winter, the bear came and slept on the hearth rug, and the children played with him.
Ah!
Then one spring morning, the bear called to Rose White and Rose Red and said, "I must leave you now, and I won't be back till after the summer. The snow started to melt and the ground has started to thaw, and this means the dwarfs come out of their caves and go above ground, and they run around the forest looking for things to steal. There's one dwarf in particular I'm very keen to catch. He gives me nothing but trouble. Grrr." Rose White and Rose Red were very sad to see their friend go, and they left the door on the latch just in case he came back and changed his mind.
Ah!
A short time later, the widow asked her 2 daughters to go into the forest to collect some wood for the kitchen fire. They saw a strange-looking creature jumping up and down. "I wonder what that is," said Rose White. "It looks like a butterfly," said Rose Red. As they drew closer, they could hear it shouting at the top of its voice, "Help me! Won't somebody please help me?" And to their amazement, they saw it was a little dwarf with a red, angry face, and it caught his very long beard on a piece of wood that was attached to the tree trunk. As soon as he caught sight of the 2 girls, he said,
What are you doing standing there like that? Come and help me at once.
"What are you trying to do?" said Rose Red.
What does it look like I'm trying to do, you silly girl? He screeched. I was trying to cut some wood up for my fire, and this wood just closing around my beard, and now I'm stuck, and I can't get myself free. While Rose White and Rose Red tugged and pulled, but to no avail, so they whispered to each other, and Rose White took out a pair of silver scissors, and snip, snap, she cut off the end of the dwarf's beard. "There," she said, "now you are free." What do you think you're doing? He cried. You've cut off my beard. I had the longest beard in the forest. Sheer bad manners, that's what it is.
And with not so much as a thank you or a smile, he trotted over to a tree trunk and picked up a huge bag of gold, which he slung over his shoulder, and he stumped off into the forest. Later that day, the 2 sisters went to the river to catch some fish for their supper. As they approached the riverbank, they could see a curious creature jumping up and down. It was making a very loud noise. It was shouting, "Help me! Won't somebody help me, please? I think I'm going to drown!" Rose White said to her sister, "I think this might be our old friend the dwarf, and he doesn't look very happy." When the dwarf caught sight of the two sisters, he screeched at them, "What are you doing standing there like that? I've caught my beard in my fishing line, and if you don't help me quickly, I shall be pulled in by this big fish and gobbled up." Well, Rose White and Rose Red did all they could to untangle the little dwarf's beard from the fishing line, and eventually they gave up. So they whispered to each other, and Rose White took out her silver scissors from her pocket, and once again she snipped off another part of the dwarf's beard. "What are you doing?" he cried. "You've done it again! Oh, you miserable wretches!" And yet again, with not so much as a thank you or a smile of gratitude, he picked up a big bag of pearls that he'd hidden in the bulrushes, and once again he stamped off furiously into the forest. A week later, the widow sent her two daughters into the town to pick up some material and thread. On their way, they had to pass through a big, clear heath, full of boulders and rocks. As they walked through, they could see a dark shape overhead, and they heard that it was making a very loud noise. When they looked up, they saw that it was a huge eagle. At first, the two sisters thought it was holding onto a bird, but when they got closer, they could see. Yes, my dears, guess who it was? That's right, it was their old friend the dwarf. He was shouting at the top of his voice, "Help me! Won't somebody please save me?" The two soft-hearted sisters knew what they had to do, and they leapt up and grabbed the poor dwarf by his feet, and they pushed and pulled and pushed and pulled till eventually the eagle had no choice but to let its prey go. When the dwarf came to his senses, they all saw that his little coat was in tatters. "Look what you've done!" he screamed. "I was the best dressed dwarf in the forest. Oh, couldn't you have been more careful?" And yet again, with not so much as a thank you or a smile, he picked up a huge bag of diamonds from behind a rock and disappeared into the ground into his cave. On the way back from the town, the two girls walked through the heath. It was getting quite dark. Ahead of them on the path was the little dwarf. "It's that rude little man again," said Rose White, and to their amazement he was counting out a huge heap of treasure. When he heard them coming from behind him, he jumped up. "What are you doing? What are you doing? Mind your own business," he said. "Go on your way." The two girls were about to pass him on the path. All of a sudden they heard a huge roar coming from the forest. Roar! The two girls, fearful for their lives, jumped behind a boulder. But the dwarf, he wasn't fast enough. It was a huge brown bear, and he picked up the dwarf with one paw. The dwarf, terrified, screamed for his life. "Oh, don't eat me! Please don't eat me!" he screamed. "I would just be a small morsel. Why don't you eat those two girls hiding behind the rocks? They'll make a tasty feast. Just please don't eat me. Take all my treasure. Just take all my treasure, please."
Ew!
The bear, he ignored the dwarf's selfish pleas, and with one mighty blow of his paw, the dwarf moved no more. The two sisters, fearful for their lives, went to run into the forest, but the bear called to them, "Rose White and Rose Red, it's me, your friend the bear. I won't hurt you." Rose White and Rose Red stopped and saw at once it was their friendly bear who'd shared their homes during the winter. As they walked towards him, the bear's fur fell to the ground, and there stood before them was a handsome prince dressed in an outfit of pure gold and red velvet. He spoke to them. "I am the son of the king, and I have been walking through this forest for years. That spiteful dwarf put a spell on me and turned me into a bear, and only when he was killed and punished would the spell be broken. Well, my dears, Rose White married the prince, and Rose Red married his brother, and they all lived together in the palace, including the poor widow, and she took her two rose bushes with her, so she could see them when she looked out of her window. And, my dears, they all lived happily ever after."
Hooray!
My dears, what a rude little dwarf he was. I hope you're not like him and you remember to say your please and thank yous. Now, dear little boys and girls, now the time is near that Mother Goose must pack her bags and disappear from here. I hope that you've all enjoyed the tales I've had to tell, and wish that in the days to come you'll think on them and dwell. For every tale contained a little lesson waiting to be learned, that the moral is the reward, but the moral, it must be earned. Boys and girls, think about the stories that I've told, of all the characters that you've met, and all the virtues I've extolled. With a little luck, you've all been taught a thing or two worth knowing, but if not, my dears, it's not my fault, because now I must be going. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, children. Bye. We hope you enjoyed our performance of Victorian Fairy Tales. Daventry Museum are delighted to announce that Don't Go Into the Cellar will be appearing live on Thursday the 29th of October at 2 p.m. Mother Goose will be visiting to share with you another selection of her favourite fairy tales. Please contact Daventry Museum now to book your place. Until we meet again, thank you all and the very best of wishes.